The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a spent cartridge, and Theodora Wallace had no answer for it. She stood in the middle of John Wells's small cabin, her dress torn at the shoulder, her dark hair loose and wild from the ride that had nearly killed her hands shaking so badly she could not hold the cup of water he had pressed into them. The lantern on the table threw warm gold light across the rough-hewn walls, and outside, the Nevada desert breathed its cold night breath against the single window. John Wells stood not 3 feet from her, his gun belt still buckled around his lean hips, his gray eyes fixed on her with an expression she could not name, not pity, not judgment, but something far more dangerous than either. Something that looked terribly close to care. "Who looks after you?" he had asked. Just that. 6 words, quiet as a prayer, and they had split her open more completely than anything the man with the brand on his wrist had done to her tonight, more completely than the 3 years she had spent surviving on the frontier alone, more completely than the moment she had buried her husband's boots, because there was nothing else left of him to put in the ground. She opened her mouth. She closed it again. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of every true thing she had refused to say out loud since the autumn of 1873, when she had arrived in the Nevada territory with $40, a trunk of mended clothes, and the absolute certainty that she did not need a single soul on this earth to keep her breathing. She had been so certain. John watched her struggle with it. He did not push. He pulled out the chair across from the table, turned it around, and sat down with his arms crossed over the back of it. And he simply waited, and the waiting was the most unbearable thing anyone had done to her in 3 years. "I look after myself," she finally said, and even she could hear how thin it sounded. Something moved across his face. Not a smile, not quite, more like the shadow of one. "That's not an answer," he said. "That's what a person says when the real answer is nobody." The word landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water, and the ring spread outward, and Theodora Wallace, who had not cried since the day she was handed those boots, felt her eyes burn in a way she despised with her entire being. It had not started here. It had not started in this cabin, on this cold October night in 1874, with a gunslinger asking questions she could not answer. It had started 6 weeks earlier, when the town of Harlan's Creek, Nevada, had acquired both a new danger and a new deputy, and Theodora had made the catastrophic mistake of believing she could outrun both of them on her own. Harlan's Creek sat at the edge of a broad, dry valley where the mountains cut the sky into jagged pieces, and in the late summer of 1874, it had a population of roughly 300 souls: miners, ranchers, a handful of merchants, the women who served them in various capacities, and one widow who ran the only bakery and dry goods counter that also, as a consequence of hard necessity, functioned as the town's informal postal service, lending library, and debt-collecting office. That widow was Theodora Wallace, and she had been running it for 2 years and 4 months since her husband Robert had died of a rattlesnake bite 3 days' ride from home, his horse coming back without him. Robert Wallace had been a decent man and a mediocre frontiersman, and Theodora had loved him in the practical, steady way you love something that keeps you warm in winter. She had not been shattered by his death. She had been left, which was worse, because being left did not break you all at once. It just wore you thinner and thinner until the light came through you in places you hadn't known existed. She was 28 years old, and she managed the shop from 6 in the morning until 7 at night, kept her own accounts in a locked ledger, traded flour and salt and rifle cartridges for credit with the ranchers, and she never, not once, asked for help from anyone. The day John Wells rode into Harlan's Creek was an ordinary Tuesday in September, dry and sharp-smelling, the kind of day that felt like the world was holding its breath. Theodora was out on the front step of the shop with a broom, pushing dust off the boards in a manner that satisfied something deeply practical in her, when the man came down the main street on a dark bay horse and stopped in front of the sheriff's office. She watched him the way she watched everything that came through Harlan's Creek, with her full attention carefully disguised as disinterest. He was tall in the saddle, broad through the shoulders, somewhere around 30 or perhaps a touch older, with the kind of face that had seen weather and kept the memory of it in every line. He wore a single revolver on his right hip, a Colt single-action army, and he wore it the way that men who actually knew how to use a firearm wore them, close to the body, not for show. His coat was dark brown leather, cracked at the elbows. He did not look at his surroundings the way a traveler does. He looked at them the way a man does, who is arriving at something rather than passing through. Sheriff Amos Giddings came out of the office to shake his hand, and Theodora swept her step and listened to the wind and did not stare. "New deputy," said old Margaret Chen at the general counter inside, appearing at Theodora's elbow like a very small ghost. Margaret ran the laundry and knew everything about everyone within a 20-mile radius, a talent she deployed with the precision of a surgeon. Giddings sent for one from Carson City. Something about the Hollies situation getting worse. The Hollies situation. Theodora pressed her lips together and said nothing, but her hands tightened on the broom handle. The Hollies situation was the reason the autumn of 1874 in Harlan's Creek was a thing with teeth. Caleb Hollies was not a man. He was a mechanism, a man-shaped engine built for extraction. He had arrived in the valley the previous spring with a legal land deed that the circuit judge had declined to challenge, 3 hired guns, and an agenda to consolidate the water rights along the creek that fed every farm and ranch within 15 miles of town. He wore a brand, a burned H inside a circle, on the inside of his right wrist, and he had given the same brand, Theodora had heard, to the 3 men he employed, like cattle to show ownership. She had seen it once, on the wrist of a man named Draper who had come into her shop to buy tobacco, and the sight of it had turned her stomach in a way she could not entirely articulate. Hollies had started with legal pressure, fees invented out of thin air, debts that nobody remembered incurring, paperwork that materialized from nowhere to claim creek access rights from families that had been living on that land for a decade. When legal pressure failed to move people fast enough, the pressure changed character. A barn burned. A horse was found shot. A man named Ellis Prout disappeared for 4 days and came back unable to talk about where he had been, but with 2 broken fingers and an expression like a man who had looked directly at the sun and was still seeing it. Theodora had given Ellis Prout credit at the shop for 3 months running because his hands were too damaged to work properly, and she had never once mentioned it to him, and he had never thanked her, and that was the arrangement that she preferred. She had her own reasons to be frightened of Hollies, though she had not told anyone what they were, because telling anyone what they were would require explaining things that were deeply private and would make her appear, she was quite certain, like a woman who needed help, which she did not, which she had decided she would never again be. The reasons were these. Robert Wallace, her late husband, had borrowed $230 from Caleb Hollies in the spring of 1872, before Hollies had become what he was now, when he was merely a land speculator passing through who had represented himself as an investor. Robert had used the money to purchase equipment for a claim that had produced almost nothing, and he had died before repaying it, and Hollies had arrived at Theodora's door in March with a document bearing Robert's signature and an expression of great professional regret. He had given her until December of 1874 to repay the debt or surrender the shop. It was now September. She had $160 of the $230. She had not told anyone. She was working on it. The new deputy settled into the small room at the back of the sheriff's office and appeared in Harlan's Creek's daily life, the way a new piece of furniture appears, suddenly present and slightly rearranging the way everything else sat. Theodora observed him for a week before he came into her shop. He came in on a Friday morning, which was her busiest morning, and he stood at the counter and waited without any visible impatience while she finished a transaction with Josie Montoya from the ranch 3 miles east, And then he bought a pound of ground coffee, a box of cartridges, and a can of peaches, and he paid in coin without complaint, and he said, "You're Theodora Wallace." It was not a question, but it was not quite a statement either. It was the kind of sentence that expects a response. "I am," she said, and gave him his change. John Wells. He put his hand out over the counter, which was unusual enough in 1874 for a man to do with a woman in a commercial setting that she was briefly uncertain what to do with it. She shook it. His grip was firm without being demonstrative. "I expect I'll be a regular customer." "I expect you will," she said. "Most people in this town are." He almost smiled. Just the left corner of his mouth, just barely. "I hear you're the most useful person in Harlan's Creek." "Whoever told you that was flattering us both," she said. He took his purchases and left, and Theodora told herself the warmth she felt in her sternum was simply the result of having had a perfectly ordinary professional interaction, and she believed this completely, and she was wrong. He came back the following Tuesday. He came back the Tuesday after that, and the one after that. He did not buy excessive amounts of goods. He was clearly a man of moderate practical habits. He came in, he purchased what he required. He spoke to her in the particular way he had direct, unhurried, with a quality of full attention that she found deeply unsettling, because nobody in Harlan's Creek paid full attention to Theodora Wallace. They paid attention to her shop, her prices, her credit terms, her bread, which was genuinely excellent. They did not pay attention to her. On his fourth visit, he said, while she was wrapping his purchase of salt and dried beans, "You know about the Prout family situation with Hollies." She did not look up from her wrapping. "I know what everyone knows." "You know more than that," he said. It was not accusatory. It was said the way a person states a fact they are not bothered by. She looked up then. He was watching her with those gray eyes that had a quality she was beginning to identify as the visual equivalent of patience, not emptiness, not blankness, but the kind of steadiness that comes from having chosen to be still. "I'm a shopkeeper," she said. "People tell me things." "I know," he said. "I was wondering if you might be willing to tell some of them to me." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Hollies and the brand on his wrist. She thought about $160 and a debt she could not mention. She thought about December, which was getting closer every day with the relentlessness of December. "Why?" she said. "Because I think Hollies is planning something, and I think it's going to come to a head before winter, and I think people are going to get hurt, and I would very much like to prevent that." He paused. "I'm not asking you to do anything dangerous. I'm asking if you'd be willing to share information." "What makes you think I have any information?" His mouth did the almost smile again. "You're the most useful person in Harlan's Creek. You said it yourself." "I said whoever told you that was flattering us both. And I decided the flattery was on my end," he said, "not yours." She finished wrapping his purchase. She pushed it across the counter. She said, "Come back Thursday evening after I close at 7. I'll have some things to tell you." He nodded once, took his goods, and left, and Theodora stood behind her counter for a long moment with her hands flat on the wood, feeling as if she had just made a decision that was going to have consequences far larger than a Thursday evening conversation. She was correct. He came back Thursday, and she had pulled the other chair around to the side of her counter near the stove, and she had made coffee, because she had been trained since childhood to offer hospitality, and the training ran deeper than any subsequent hardship. And they sat together in the lamplit quiet of the closed shop, and she told him everything she knew. She told him about Ellis Prout's broken fingers and his 4 missing days. She told him about the barn that had burned, and whose barn it was, and when, and the fact that 3 different people had independently told her they had seen 2 of Hollies' men in the area the night before. She told him about the legal documents that had circulated through town, the ones that nobody could afford a lawyer to challenge, and she told him about the circuit judge, whose name was Harlan, and the fact that Harlan had been seen twice in the company of Hollies' men at the saloon. She did not tell him about the $230. John Wells listened to all of it without interrupting, with a small leather notebook open on his knee into which he wrote occasional short notations, and when she finished he looked up at her and said, "You've been carrying all of this by yourself." "I've been observing," she corrected. "There's a difference." "There's not as much of one as you're suggesting," he said. She changed the subject. "What are you going to do with it?" He told her, in patient and precise detail, what he was going to do with it, and it involved a letter to the territorial marshal's office, and a separate inquiry into Judge Harmon's conduct, and a more immediate matter of documenting the intimidation for a formal record that could be used against Hollis in a legitimate proceeding. It was careful, methodical work. It was the work of a man who had thought about the law not as a blunt instrument but as a structure, fragile and necessary and worth maintaining. "This could take months," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "Hollis won't wait months." "No," he agreed. "He won't." The evenings became a pattern. Thursday evenings, after closing, coffee and lamplight and conversation that began as the sharing of intelligence and gradually, without either of them making any decision about it, expanded into something larger. She told him about the ranching families and their histories and their rivalries. He told her about the territorial marshal's investigation that he was quietly supporting. She told him about the water rights and the specific geography of the creek. He told her about the 3 men Hollis employed, their histories and their likely behaviors. And then, because conversation has a way of finding its own shape regardless of what you intended it to do, they began to tell each other things. He told her that he had come to law enforcement late, after years of work in the mining industry that he described briefly and without elaboration, and that he had found it suited something in him that the mining had not. She told him about Ohio, where she had grown up, the daughter of a postmaster, which explained the ledgers and the letters and her precise, comprehensive memory for names and facts and figures. He told her that he had been a different kind of person at 25 than he was now. She told him that she had been a different kind of person at 25 too, and they did not press each other on the specifics, and the restraint was a form of respect they were both grateful for. She began to notice things about him that had nothing to do with law enforcement or Caleb Hollis or the political situation in Harlan's Creek. She noticed that he moved carefully in small spaces, mindful of not crowding. She noticed that he always placed his hat on the same hook by the door without looking for it. With the automatic courtesy of a man who doesn't want to take up space he hasn't been invited to take. She noticed that he laughed very seldom but very genuinely, a low, surprised sound, as if laughter ambushed him and he was somewhat pleased by the ambush. She noticed that when he looked at her, and the directness of it was something she had stopped being able to dismiss as merely professional after the 3rd Thursday. She told herself this was fine. She was a practical woman. She could notice things about a person and manage those things privately and keep them from causing any disruption to her life. She had managed a good deal of disruption on her own for 3 years. She could certainly manage this. What she could not manage, as it turned out, was Caleb Hollis accelerating his timeline. In the 2nd week of October, 3 things happened in rapid succession. The territorial marshal's office sent back a letter that was not a commitment but was also not a refusal, which John described as progress. Judge Harmon left Harlan's Creek quietly and did not return, which John described as significant. And Caleb Hollis appeared at Theodora's shop on a Wednesday morning, alone, and stood at her counter with his broad, pale hands flat on the wood and said, in a tone of great professional regret, "I'm afraid I need to move up our arrangement, Mrs. Wallace. I'll need the full amount by the 15th of November." November 15th was 6 weeks away. She had $160. She needed $230. She was $70 short, which was not an insurmountable amount in the abstract, and was a completely insurmountable amount in the specific circumstance of a dry goods shop in a frontier town in October with no additional income in sight. She met Hollis's eyes and said, "I'll need that in writing." He smiled the smile of a man who has never needed to use his teeth to eat and said, Of course. And he placed a document on the counter that had already been prepared, which told her exactly how long he had been planning to move the date, and she signed it, and he left, and she stood behind her counter and felt the specific, controlled quality of terror that she had learned to wear like a coat. She did not tell John Wells that evening. She told herself it was because Thursday's meeting was tomorrow, and she did not want to confuse the professional arrangement. She told herself this was sensible. She told herself a great many things on Wednesday evening while she sat alone in the back of the shop with her ledger open, doing arithmetic that kept coming out the same way no matter how many times she worked it. On Thursday, she told him everything about the Prout situation, and the latest information about Hollis's movements, and the fact that 2 of Hollis's men had been seen surveying the land north of the creek the previous weekend, and she did not tell him about November 15th. He listened to all of it, and then he folded his notebook closed and looked at her and said, "What else?" She looked back at him. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do," he said very quietly. "Something happened this week that you're not telling me." The stove ticked in the silence. Outside, someone was playing a harmonica badly somewhere down the street, and the sound drifted in thin and lonesome. "It's a private matter," she said. "Theodora." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the way he said it was not demanding, and it was not soft, and it was not anything she had a ready defense against. It was simply the sound of someone who was paying full attention and had chosen to name what he was paying attention to. "I'm not asking to solve anything. I'm asking because I'd like to know." She looked at the stove for a long moment. Then she told him about the debt and the document and the November 15th deadline and the $70 she did not have. The quality of stillness that came over him then was different from his usual quiet. It was the stillness of a man who is controlling something. "Hollis," he said after a moment. "Hollis gave your husband that money." "My husband is dead," she said. "The debt belongs to me." "Does the document hold up legally?" She had thought about this. She had thought about it with the precision that 3 years of running a business had given her. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I don't have a lawyer and the circuit judge has left town and I don't have the money to pursue either option even if I did. I can look at the document." "It's a private matter," she said again, but weaker this time because she knew already that this argument had a limited lifespan. "I know it is," he said. "I'm not trying to take it from you. I'm offering to look at a piece of paper." He paused. "You don't have to accept the offer." She brought him the document. He read it carefully twice, turning it toward the lantern and reading it again. He put it down and pressed the heel of his hand against it, flattening it on the table. "This document has a problem," he said. "Your husband's signature is witnessed by 2 people. I know one of those witnesses. He left this territory in the spring of 1873. He could not have witnessed a signature in May of 1873 if he was already gone." He looked up at her. "This document may be fraudulent." The word landed in the room and rearranged everything in it. "I would need to confirm it," he said, "and I would need more time than we have. But Theodora, this is something." She sat very still. She thought about 2 years of arithmetic. She thought about Hollis's smile and his professional regret. She thought about the brand on his man's wrist, and what kind of man uses a brand on another man's skin. "He knows I can't prove it," she said. "Not yet," John said. She looked at him across the table in the lamplit quiet, and something shifted in her chest that she could not entirely account for, something that had to do with the word "yet" and the confidence behind it, and the way he had said it not as reassurance, but as a statement of fact, solid and unadorned, the kind of certainty that comes from competence rather than optimism. "You should have told me sooner," he said, and it was not a reproach, just the truth said plainly. "I didn't want to," she said, equally plain. "Why not?" She looked at the stove again. It was easier than looking at him when she was about to say something true. "Because telling someone means needing something from them," she said, "and I stopped doing that a long time ago." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of things that neither of them named. He began to investigate the fraudulent witness. He did it carefully and methodically, sending letters through official channels to verify the man's location in the spring of 1873, and he told her it would take 2 to 3 weeks for responses to come back, and he warned her that even if the document was fraudulent, the legal process of proving it would require resources and time they might not have. In the meantime, Harlan's Creek began to deteriorate. Hollis, apparently sensing that his comfortable position was being examined, changed his approach. Instead of legal pressure, he shifted to social pressure. His men in the saloon, talking loudly and selectively, spreading the particular kind of story that is hard to disprove because it is not quite specific enough to deny. Stories about the reliability of certain people's credit. Stories about a widow running a shop that was perhaps not quite as solvent as it appeared. Stories that were not quite accusations, but that had the cumulative effect of making certain merchants wonder whether accepting Theodora's credit slips was entirely wise. She lost 3 customers in a week. She did not tell John immediately, because the situation was evolving quickly and she was attempting to manage it, and because some stubborn, surviving part of her was still deeply resistant to the practice of asking for help. But he noticed, because he noticed everything about Harlan's Creek that was relevant to Hollis, and she had become relevant to Hollis in a way she had not anticipated, and he came into the shop on a Monday, which was not their Thursday arrangement, and said, "I've heard some things." "So have I," she said. He leaned against the counter. He was not wearing his coat, just the dark flannel shirt and the gun belt, and the informality of it meant he had come straight from somewhere rather than making a deliberate call, and there was something about the absence of the deliberate frame that made the visit feel different from their Thursday evenings, more immediate, more simply him. "He's trying to isolate you," John said. "He knows I'm looking at the document and he's responding. He doesn't know you're looking at the document specifically." "He knows someone is looking at something," John said. "Men like Hollis have instincts about when they're being watched. He's not smart in the way that reads books, but he's smart in the way that survives, and that kind sometimes has better instincts than the other kind." He paused. "I want you to be careful." "I'm always careful," she said. "I know you are," he said. "I'm asking you to be careful in a different way. Don't walk home alone after dark. Don't, John." She said his name and he stopped. It was the first time she had used it. She felt them both register the fact. "I have been alone in this town for 2 years. I have been managing men who want things from me, legally and otherwise, for 2 years. I appreciate the concern and I hear it, and I am asking you to trust that I know how to read a room." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I do trust that. Thank you. I'm still asking you not to walk home alone after dark." She almost smiled. "That seems like a reasonable compromise," she said. He began walking her home on the evenings he was not on duty. It was a distance of 3 blocks, along a route that passed 2 other buildings and opened onto the small yard behind which she kept her house. A 2-room structure that Robert had built in the first year of their marriage, rough and serviceable and deeply familiar. The walks took 4 or 5 minutes and they talked during them, about the investigation and about Hollis's movements, and about the people of Harlan's Creek, and about smaller things too, the way conversation does when it has found a groove and follows it without needing to be directed. On the 4th such walk, on a clear cold evening in mid-October when the sky was so full of stars that it felt weighted, she said, "Can I ask you something personal?" He glanced at her. The lamplight from the buildings they were passing made his face alternately bright and shadowed. "You can ask me anything," he said. "Why law enforcement? You said you came to it late." He was quiet for a moment, and she had the sense that he was deciding how much of the answer to give rather than what the answer was. "I was in mining for 6 years," he said. "Around Silver City and then further west. I did well enough. And one winter, I won't go into all the particulars, a man I worked with was robbed and beaten badly by the men he'd trusted to help him, and the people whose job it was to respond to that simply did not." He paused. "I had resources to pursue it informally. I did. And in pursuing it, I found that I was good at it, and that being good at something that actually helps people is different from being good at something that just produces. So, he glanced at her again briefly. Late arrival. What happened to the man, your friend? He recovered, John said. He has a family, he's in Utah now. He paused. He knows I look in on him when I can. She thought about this as they walked. She thought about a person who pursues a wrong until it is corrected and then stays connected to the person he corrected it for. You're not what I expected, she said. What did you expect? She considered this honestly. A man using the badge for the authority it provides, she said. Most men do. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Some days I can see how it becomes that, he said. It's easy enough to let it. The authority is real and it's immediate and it has a pull to it. He paused. I try to remember that the authority exists to protect something, not to be the thing itself. They had arrived at her gate. She stopped and he stopped. The night was very cold and very quiet around them, the kind of quiet that makes a person's breathing audible, and she was aware of him standing close enough that she could feel the warmth off his arm even through her coat. Thank you for walking me home, she said. Good night, Theodora, he said. She went inside and stood in her dark front room for a long moment with her hand on the doorframe, feeling something she had deliberately not felt for a very long time, something that had no practical application and no reasonable outcome, and that she was almost certainly going to regret. She went to bed and did not regret it at all, which was worse. The response letters about the fraudulent witness came back in the last week of October, and John brought them to her on a Tuesday evening and spread them on the counter. 2 letters from 2 separate official sources in Nevada and California, both confirming that the man who had supposedly witnessed Robert Wallace's signature in May of 1873 had been verifiably in San Francisco at that time, with documentation. The signature on Holly's document was either forged or the witness statement was wholly invented. This is enough to challenge the document, John said. This is enough to take to a judge, not Harlan, the circuit court in Carson City, and have it set aside. You don't owe Holly's anything, Theodora. The debt is fraudulent. She looked at the letters. She looked at his handwriting in the margins, the careful annotations cross-referencing the dates. She thought about the night she had sat alone with her ledger doing arithmetic that always came out wrong. You did all of this, she said. It was the right thing to do, he said, and it serves the larger investigation. If Holly's is willing to forge debt documents for one person, he's done it to others. He has, she said. She had heard in the accumulated intelligence of 3 years behind a shop counter about at least 4 other arrangements that had the same shape as hers. I can give you names. I know, he said, I'd like them. She gave him the names, and then she looked at him across the counter and said, John, thank you. He met her eyes. You don't need to thank me. I know I don't need to, she said. I'm doing it because I want to. Something in him changed quality in that moment, some held thing releasing fractionally, and she felt it like a change in atmospheric pressure. He looked at her with those gray eyes and said nothing for a moment, and what he did not say was as present in the room as anything either of them had spoken. I'll file the challenge tomorrow morning, he said. With any luck, by the time Holly's realizes what's happening, the document will already be before the circuit judge. He gathered the letters carefully. You should lock your door tonight. I always lock my door, she said. Lock it earlier than usual, he said. She wanted to ask him why specifically, but his expression had shifted back to the careful, professional register, and she understood that whatever he was worried about, he had decided not to alarm her with it, and she also understood that this was probably a mistake. She locked the door early. She was asleep by 9 o'clock, which was early for her, the weeks of tension having accumulated into a fatigue that outweighed her usual habit of staying up with her ledger until nearly 11. She was deeply asleep when the sound woke her, not a loud sound, just a change in the quality of the dark, a creak that was not the house settling. She was out of bed and to the side of the window before she was fully awake, the instincts of 3 years on the frontier operating faster than conscious thought, and she looked out through the edge of the curtain and saw, by the light of a moon just past full, a man standing in her yard. She knew him. His name was Draper, and he worked for Holly's, and he had the brand on his wrist. He was standing very still, facing the house, and he had his right hand loose at his side near the pistol on his hip. She was dressed and out the back before the thought was fully formed. She went out the back door and through the narrow alley between her house and the next, moving quickly and carefully the way you move when you are afraid but cannot afford to be afraid loudly. She came out onto the side street and walked fast, not running because running draws attention in a way that walking does not, toward the sheriff's office and specifically toward the light that was still on at the back of it. The light she had observed over the past weeks was John's habit. He stayed late, working, the way she stayed late with her ledger. The light was on. She knocked. He opened the door within seconds, which suggested he had been near it rather than at the desk, and his expression when he saw her was not surprise but something closer to grim confirmation. He had expected something tonight. He stepped back to let her in and looked past her down the street. "Draper," he said. "In my yard," she said. Her voice was steady and she was furious at herself for arriving here because it confirmed everything she had spent 3 years avoiding, but she was also, underneath the fury, deeply relieved, and the relief was so powerful it frightened her. "Are you hurt?" "No, I left before he did anything." He nodded. He was already putting on his coat. "Stay here," he said. She stayed. She stood in the office with her arms crossed and her heart beating in a way that was not appropriate for a woman who had everything under control, and she listened to the night outside and waited, and it was the longest 7 minutes she could remember living through, including some that had objectively been much more consequential. He came back alone. "He's gone," John said. "He saw me coming and went. I've put the word in with Giddings. There'll be someone watching your property tonight." He paused. "Tomorrow morning, I'm filing the challenge to the document, and I'm also filing a formal complaint against Holly's for intimidation. The letter to the territorial marshal is already written. It's going out first light." She stood in the middle of the sheriff's office, and the candle on the desk threw light across the walls and the wanted notices and the single window, and she realized that she was shaking, not from cold. She had been shaking since she saw Draper in the yard and had simply not permitted herself to notice it until now. "Come and sit down," he said. The way he said it was not gentle in a condescending sense. It was simply direct and practical, the way he said everything, but it had a quality underneath it that she recognized as the particular tenderness of a person trying very hard not to impose their tenderness. She sat down in the chair across from the desk. He put on water for coffee on the small iron stove in the corner. And then he sat across from her with his arms folded on his knees, watching her with those steady gray eyes, and he said the words that had broken something open in her. "Who looks after you?" And she had no answer for him. She sat in the silence and let herself hear the question as it had actually been asked. Not as a challenge, not as a judgment, not as an indictment of her 3 years of determined self-sufficiency, but as a genuine, open inquiry, the kind you make when you are looking at someone and seeing them clearly and you want to understand something about how they are surviving. "Nobody," she finally said, and saying it out loud was not the devastation she had expected. It was something else. It was closer to setting down a weight she had forgotten she was carrying. "That's what I thought," he said. "I've managed," she said. "I know you have," he said. "Theodora, I can see clearly that you have managed. I'm not questioning any of it." He looked at her steadily. "I'm asking because I would like the answer to be different." The stove ticked. The coffee water began to make sound. Outside, somewhere far off, a coyote made its night sound, distant and winding. "Different how?" she said, though she knew. She was not a woman who failed to understand what was being said to her. "Different in the direction of me," he said very simply. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about Draper in the yard and the long walk through the alley and the relief she had felt when his light was still on. She thought about Thursday evenings and lamplit counters and the almost smile that appeared without planning on the left side of his mouth. She thought about the letters he had written, patiently and methodically, to prove a wrong she had been carrying alone for 2 years. She thought about Robert, who had been a decent man and who had left, which was not his fault, but which had happened, and about what she had decided after it happened, and about how long decisions made in pain are meant to last. "I don't know how to do that anymore," she said. "Let someone in that direction." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to do it instantly." He paused. "I'm asking if you're willing to try." She thought about it, really thought about it, the way she thought about ledger entries and credit arrangements and the arithmetic of survival. She thought about the costs and the risks and the fact that she was 28 years old and had already spent 3 years insisting on her own sufficiency and would presumably spend many more years in this life, and what those years might look like, and what this conversation might look like from the far end of them. "Yes," she said, "I'm willing to try." He exhaled, not loudly, just a quiet release of something held, and he looked at her with an expression that was wholly unguarded in a way she had not seen his face before, something behind the professional steadiness stepping briefly forward, and it was the most personal thing he had shown her, and it was considerable. He poured the coffee. They sat for another hour, talking in a quieter and more personal register than their Thursday conversations about Ohio and the postmaster father and the smell of letter ink, about the mining years and the friend in Utah and the cold winters in the Silver City camps, about the specific quality of the Nevada sky at night, which was different from the Ohio sky and different from the California sky in ways that were difficult to articulate, but that both of them had noticed. About the future, carefully and without pressure, the way you talk about the future when it is just beginning to feel like it might be a shared thing. When she finally said she should go home, he walked her, and the deputy on watch was visible near her front gate, and she went inside and locked the door and stood in her front room, and the feeling she had now was entirely different from the feeling she had had 3 weeks ago on this same spot. It was not warmer, exactly. It was more like being in a place you recognize, for the first time seeing it in daylight. The legal challenge filed the following morning moved through the circuit court with a speed that surprised even John, who attributed it to the clarity of the fraudulent witness evidence, and the fact that the territorial marshal's office had become actively interested in Caleb Holly's as a regional problem rather than a local one. Within 2 weeks, the debt document was formally set aside. Within 3 weeks, the territorial marshal's office had sent an investigator to Harlan's Creek to begin the process of examining Holly's consolidated water rights documents and the systematic pattern of fraudulent debt instruments that Theodora's case had been the clearest example of. Caleb Holly's left Harlan's Creek in the second week of November, quietly and without announcement, taking his 3 men with him. He left the way men like him always leave when the legal structure catches up with them, not with drama, not with confrontation, just with absence. One day he was there, and then he was not, and the town breathed differently without him, the way a room breathes differently when a window is opened. Ellis Prout came into the shop on the Monday after Holly's left. He bought tobacco and a small amount of flour. He put his coin on the counter, and then he also put a small folded piece of paper on the counter beside it, and when Theodora looked at him he said, gruffly, "For the credit," and left before she could respond. The paper had $65 in it, which was more than he owed. She put 40 of it in the credit ledger, and the rest in the fund she had started for the Montoya family, whose barn Holly's men had burned in the spring. Josie Montoya found out about the fund, and came into the shop with her eyes bright and her jaw set in the specific expression of a woman who is deeply moved and deeply uncomfortable about it in equal measure. And she said, "You didn't have to do that." And Theodora said, "I know." And they regarded each other for a moment with the particular respect of 2 women who had been managing the frontier on their own for a long time, and recognized the shape of it in each other. John came to the shop the following Thursday, as he always did, but the Thursday evening conversation had by now evolved so far from its original intelligence-sharing purpose that neither of them acknowledged the evolution. They simply sat in the lamplit quiet and talked, and the talking had a different quality than it had had in September, a new ease in it, the ease of people who have moved through a crisis together and come out the other side and found each other still there. He brought her something that evening, which he placed on the counter with an expression that was slightly awkward in a way she found entirely charming, a small book of poems, Mary Wollstonecraft, 2nd edition, which he had sent away through a bookseller in Carson City. "You mentioned your father's library," he said. "I thought you might not have this one." She had not. She held it in both hands and looked at the cover and then looked at him. "John Wells," she said, "this is the nicest thing anyone has given me in 3 years." "That's a very low bar," he said. "Set by circumstances," she agreed, "not by the standard of the gift." He smiled, fully, both sides of his mouth, and it was the first time she had seen him do it without holding any part of it back, and it rearranged something in her understanding of what his face was capable of. She stepped out from behind the counter and stood in front of him, and it was a deliberate choice, to be on the same side of the counter, to remove the professional geography, and he understood this because he was a person who understood what spaces meant. She was not a small woman, but he was tall, and she had to look up slightly, and this too she registered as information. She put her hand on his forearm, the one resting on the counter, and said, "Thank you for the book and for the rest of it." He turned his hand over under hers so that his palm was up, and his fingers closed around hers, and he said, "Thank you for trusting me with it." They stood like that in the lamplit quiet of her closed shop, holding hands across no barrier at all, and Theodora felt something in her chest that she recognized as the precise opposite of the feeling she had been carrying for 3 years. Not the absence of weight, but the presence of something warm and solid and entirely real, and she let herself feel it without managing it, which was possibly the most difficult and most important thing she had done in a very long time. He asked her to dinner the following Saturday, which was not a frontier town's most romantic setting, but the hotel had a dining room with actual tablecloths, and Margaret Chen's niece, who worked the tables, gave them the corner seat without being asked because Margaret Chen knew everything and had opinions about outcomes. The dinner lasted 3 hours, and they talked about everything except Hollies and the case and water rights and anything professional at all. And by the end of it, Theodora had laughed 4 separate times in a way that surprised her. The way John's laughs surprised him, caught off guard by something that turned out to be joyful. He walked her home after. At her gate he stopped and she stopped, and the November night was cold and clear, and the stars were doing what Nevada stars always did, which was an extraordinary amount of work. He looked at her with the full attention gray eyes and said, "I would very much like to kiss you if that's all right." "Yes," she said, "it is." He did, and it was careful and warm and real, the way he was, and she kissed him back in the way she had begun to let herself be present, without management, without the part of her that stood at a distance from her own life making notations. When he pulled back, his expression was still warm but also slightly dazed, and she found this deeply pleasing. "Good night, Theodora Wallace," he said. "Good night, John Wells," she said. She went inside and stood in her front room, and the house felt different than it had at any point in the previous 2 years. Not warmer in temperature, warmer in some other dimension that she didn't have a ledger category for and was no longer trying to create one. The winter came to Harlan's Creek the way Nevada winters do, without drama but with commitment, the cold settling in hard and dry, and the mornings beginning with frost that turned the valley silver until 10 o'clock. The shop did well in winter because people needed supplies and nobody wanted to make the journey to the larger supply town at the far end of the valley, and Theodora was busy enough that the days moved fast. John's official position stabilized as the Hollies investigation concluded, and the territorial marshal's findings were formalized. He was offered a permanent position as Harlan's Creek's 2nd deputy, which he accepted, and which meant that his presence in the town was no longer subject to the uncertainty of a temporary appointment. He said, presenting this information to her one evening, "I'm not going anywhere," with a deliberate flatness that meant he was saying it about more than the job, and she understood this, and she said, "I'm glad," and that was that. They spent December in a state of gradual, unforced closeness. He helped her with a repair to the shop's back storeroom that had been deteriorating since the summer and that she had been managing around for months. She fed him dinner twice a week, which was the natural evolution of the Thursday coffee, and he was honest about what he liked and equally honest about what he was less enthusiastic about, and she adjusted nothing, which he found very funny. He told her more about the mining years, the specific parts he had not told her in September, that they had involved a period of real difficulty, before the friend in Utah and the wrong that had been righted, a period of drinking more than he should and living harder than he intended to, a period he had come out of slowly and entirely by his own effort, and that he told her now because he wanted her to know the whole thing rather than the curated version. She listened to all of it without flinching, because she was not a woman who flinched from truth, and she said, when he was done, "Everyone who has survived anything difficult has a period like that. The relevant question is what they did with it." "What did you do with yours?" he asked. "Built a shop," she said, "made bread, kept very precise ledgers." He took her hand across the dinner table and held it, and neither of them said anything, because everything that needed saying was being said in the particular warmth of the contact. On Christmas Day, which was a Tuesday, she opened the shop for half a day because several families depended on her for supplies they could not get elsewhere, and afterward he came and they had dinner at her house, and it was the first Christmas in 3 years she had not spent alone. They sat at her small table with the candles lit and food she had made, and they talked about Christmases from childhood, his in Missouri. She had not known he was from Missouri until that evening, hers in Ohio, the particular architecture of family holidays before circumstances had dispersed everything. It was a quiet, warm evening, deeply ordinary in the best way, and she thought, sitting across from him in the candlelight, that this was what she had not known she was trying to build when she had arrived in Nevada with $40 and a trunk of mended clothes. Not independence for its own sake. A life with room in it for someone to ask who looks after you and mean it. He gave her a gift that evening, a small tin of the fancy tea that the supply store in the next town sometimes had and that she had mentioned once in passing as something she missed from Ohio. She looked at the tin and then at him and said, "You remembered that." "I remember everything you tell me," he said simply. She had gotten him a new pair of leather gloves because his old ones were cracked beyond usefulness, which was practical and necessary, and also the most careful she had been in selecting any practical item in recent memory, trying 4 pairs on her own hands to compare the quality of the leather before deciding. He put them on immediately and said they were the best gloves he had ever owned, and she believed him, which was a change from how she usually received compliments. January arrived with a storm that kept people indoors for 4 days, and during those 4 days John spent a significant amount of time at Theodora's shop and house, helping where there was helping to do and being present in the particular way that people are present when presence is the thing they have come to offer. He fixed the stove flue that had been drawing badly, working in the low-ceilinged back room of the shop with patient, systematic attention. She read to him from the book of poems which she had been working through slowly, and he listened with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, occasionally asking her to read something again. On the evening of the 4th day, when the storm had eased and the town was beginning to resurface, they were sitting by the stove in her house, and she said, without particular preamble, because she had been thinking about it for 2 days and had reached the natural end of that process, "I love you, John." He looked at her. His expression was the unguarded one she had seen once before, the night in the sheriff's office, but broader and clearer. "I love you, Theodora," he said, with a directness that was absolutely characteristic of him and absolutely devastating in the best possible way. She crossed the space between them and sat beside him on the bench near the stove, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they sat in the warm quiet of the room while the wind worked at the windows, and it was as simple and as complete as anything she had experienced. Spring arrived in the Nevada Valley with the particular optimism of springs in desert country, sudden, vivid, almost aggressive in its color after the brown of winter. The creek ran fuller with snowmelt, and the hills went briefly and brilliantly green, and Harlan's Creek expanded its commerce in the way frontier towns always do when winter releases them new settlers, new transactions, a general reopening of everything that had been contracted against the cold. John Wells asked Theodora Wallace to marry him on a morning in early April, at her shop counter, which was where he had first spoken to her and which seemed to both of them entirely appropriate. He did not make a great production of it. He came in during the quiet hour before the morning rush and stood at the counter and said, "I want to marry you. I want to make a life with you in this town, or wherever you choose, and I want to do it properly and permanently. Will you?" She looked at him across the counter with the morning light coming in the window and the shop around them full of flour and salt and cartridges and the careful ledger of a life she had built alone, and she said, "Yes, John, I will." He smiled the full smile, both sides, unheld, and came around the counter, which was their gesture now, the shorthand of it. The space between them closed, and kissed her in the empty morning shop in the April light. They were married in June at the small church at the edge of Harlan's Creek, in a ceremony officiated by the minister who served the town when the circuit brought him through, which it did reliably in June. It was not a large ceremony. The people who came were the ones who mattered: Josie Montoya from the ranch and her family, old Margaret Chen, who cried consistently and completely without embarrassment from the third row, Ellis Prout, who stood at the back and left quickly afterward and said nothing but whose presence said everything, and Sheriff Giddings, who gave a short toast at the dinner afterward that included the information that John Wells was the finest deputy he had ever worked with, and that Theodora Wallace ran the best shop in the Nevada Territory, which was high praise delivered in the gruff economy of a man who did not say things he didn't mean. Theodora wore a dress she had remade from her best material, dark blue, with white buttons down the front, and her hair pinned up in a way she had not worn it since Ohio, and John wore his good coat and a clean shirt, and they stood in the June light and made promises to each other that they had already been keeping for months, which is the best way to make promises, when they are confirmations rather than intentions. They moved her things into the larger house at the edge of town that John had rented in anticipation, and the shop remained hers to run, and this was an arrangement they had discussed with practical directness, and that suited them both entirely. He did not want her to stop running it. She did not want to stop running it. It was her work and her place in the community and the daily structure of her life, and he understood this because he was a person who understood what work meant to the people who had built it with their own effort. They were building something together now, which was different from building alone, and Theodora learned this difference gradually, in the specific ways you learn things that are more complex than ledger arithmetic. She learned that it was possible to be worried about something and tell him about it without the telling being a defeat. She learned that his habit of walking toward problems rather than away from them was contagious, and that she had in fact always had this habit too, which was part of why they were well matched. She learned that he slept on his left side and that he was a very light sleeper, and that the sounds of the house settling did not wake him, but the sound of her moving did, even when she was trying not to, and that he would say, without opening his eyes, "What's wrong?" And it was both annoying and deeply comforting, the particular combination of which she was becoming very fond. He learned that she was ruthlessly honest in all domestic matters, and that this was not unkindness, but the expression of a respect that trusted him to handle truth. He learned that her bread, which was genuinely excellent as its reputation claimed, was the product of a process she approached with the same systematic precision she brought to the ledgers, and that interrupting this process was inadvisable. He learned that she cried very seldom, and that when she did it was real and not performance, and that the appropriate response was to be present without comment, which he found he was able to do, which she found she was grateful for. In the autumn of 1875, Theodora discovered she was pregnant, and she told John over dinner with a plainness that was characteristic of her, and his response was a silence that lasted approximately 4 seconds before he got up and came around the table and held her face in his hands and looked at her with an expression that contained so many things at once that she stopped trying to catalog them and simply received it. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "A little," she said. "Are you?" "Yes," he said, with the honesty that was one of the things she loved most about him, "and very glad." "Same," she said. The pregnancy went well, which she attributed to the fact that she was in good health, and that her work kept her active, and that she had a person who noticed when she was tired and said so before she admitted it, which moved the admission earlier in the process than it had historically been. She kept working at the shop through most of it, reducing her hours in the later months at John's request, and her own practical acknowledgement that sitting down more often was advisable. Their son was born in the spring of 1876, delivered by the doctor who had arrived in Harlan's Creek in the winter to considerable general relief, a capable and serious man from Baltimore named Aldrich, who had come west for reasons he kept private, and who did his job with thoroughness and care. The birth was not without its difficulties. It went long, and there was a period in the middle of it that was frightening in the particular focused way that fear gets when you cannot look away from it. But it resolved, and the child arrived in the world in the early morning hours with an immediate and emphatic announcement of his existence that reassured everyone in the house. John held his son with both hands, standing in the lamplight with Theodora watching from the bed, and his face did something she had never seen it do. It simply went open, all the steadiness and the professional composure and the careful management entirely absent, just the raw and unmediated fact of this child in his hands, and his eyes were bright, and she could see him breathing deliberately, trying to stay level, not quite managing it. And she loved him more in that moment than she had thought she was capable of loving anything. They named him Thomas Robert Wells, Thomas for John's father and Robert for hers, a decision she had made privately and then announced, and he had looked at her and said after a moment, "Robert was your first husband's name," and she had said, "Yes, and it was my father's name. The name belongs to him first," and John had said, "Thomas Robert," and nodded, and that was settled. Thomas Robert Wells was a decided, energetic person from approximately the first week of his life, which John pointed out was entirely predictable given his parentage, and which Theodora declined to disagree with. He grew in the way children grow in frontier towns, with the freedom and the roughness and the particular adaptability of a child whose daily life includes both flour sacks and the wide valley sky. Harlan's Creek grew too. By 1877, it had a schoolhouse, a church that was no longer dependent on the circuit minister, but had its own, a second doctor who was a woman named Clara Reeves, which caused a significant amount of commentary that Theodora engaged with directly and without patience for the commentary, and a population that had pushed past 500. The shop expanded in the spring of 1877, adding a proper back storage room and a new counter, and Theodora hired a young woman named Adeline Park to help behind the counter, which was a decision she approached with the same practical directness she brought to all business decisions. John was made the senior deputy in the winter of 1876, when Giddings began to speak about retirement, and by 1878, when Giddings did in fact retire to his daughter's family in Sacramento, John Wells was the natural choice for sheriff, and was elected in the November vote without meaningful opposition. He wore the sheriff's star with the same undemonstrative competence with which he had worn the deputy's badge, and nothing about his character changed as a result of the elevation, which was the best evidence that it suited him. In the spring of 1878, Theodora was pregnant again, and this time it was easier from the beginning, or perhaps she was simply more experienced with herself, which amounted to the same thing. Their daughter was born in November of 1878, a cool, clear evening that smelled of sage and coming snow, and she came into the world with somewhat less drama than Thomas had, and was placed immediately in Theodora's arms, and was very quiet, observing the room with dark eyes that John said looked like Theodora's and Theodora said looked like his. They named her Frances, after nobody in particular, simply because they had talked about names one evening, and Frances had been the one that felt right to both of them when they said it aloud. Thomas, who was 2 years old and had recently become very interested in his own importance, received his sister with a mixture of fascination and territorial concern that Theodora managed with the same systematic patience she brought to any complex situation, and which resolved, over the following weeks, into a protectiveness that became one of the things she noted with quiet pride in the ledger of parenthood she was keeping in her mind. The years moved through Harlan's Creek the way years move through towns that are becoming something, not slowly, not dramatically, but with the cumulative weight of everything that happens in the ordinary measure of days. Winters that were hard and summers that were generous and springs that were sudden and beautiful. Commerce and community and the constant pressure and reward of lives lived closely with other lives. Theodora kept the shop, and it was good. She was known throughout the valley and beyond as the woman who kept fair prices and honest accounts, and who remembered, without consulting any record, the credit terms of every family who dealt with her, and who had a particular and well-documented inability to allow a person in genuine difficulty to leave without the thing they needed, regardless of what the ledger said at that moment. This last characteristic troubled her sometimes from a business perspective, and she had a very clear-eyed conversation about it with herself regularly, and always arrived at the same conclusion, which was that she could make the books work, and that the alternative was not something she was willing to live with. John kept the peace with the quiet efficiency that was native to him, and the town under his sheriffship was not without incident. No frontier town was, but the incidents were managed and resolved, and the structural justice that he cared about more than any individual case was something he worked toward steadily, and with the kind of patience that produces real change rather than just the appearance of it. He brought in 2 deputies of his own choosing as the town grew, and he trained them with the same attention he brought to everything, and they were good. He was home every evening that the work permitted, and the evenings at home had a shape that Theodora loved. The children at table, Thomas increasingly full of opinions about things he had learned at the schoolhouse, Frances quieter but attentive, taking in information with the focus of a person who is building a comprehensive picture. Dinner and the particular conversation of a household in which everyone present had views on matters large and small, and afterward the children to bed and the quiet of the house settling around them, and the 2 of them in the lamplight with books or conversation, or the simple companionship of 2 people who had found each other in the middle of a hard life and chosen to stay. In the evening sometimes she would look at him across the table or across the room and remember the question he had asked her in the sheriff's office in October of 1874, and she thought about the answer she had not been able to give him, and she thought about all the ways the answer had changed since then. She had told him one evening in their 2nd year of marriage about that moment, what the question had done to her, what it had cracked open. He had listened with his full attention as always, and when she finished he said, "I wasn't trying to expose anything, I just needed to know." "I know," she said. "That was why it worked." He looked at her steadily. "And now," he said, "who looks after you now?" She looked at him across the table in the lamplight of their house, with their son asleep in the next room and the Nevada night pressing its cold face against the windows, and she said, You do. I do. We look after each other." He nodded once. The quiet, comprehensive nod she had come to know meant he had received something fully. "That's exactly it," he said. And it was. By 1880, the life they had built had the solid, settled quality of something that has been tested and has held. The shop was profitable and growing, and Adeline Park had become an indispensable partner in running it. The town was established and expanding, and John's office was a point of stability at its center. Thomas was 4 and relentlessly curious, and had recently developed an attachment to the idea of horses that occupied considerable family conversation. Frances was nearly 2, and had a vocabulary that Theodora noted in her private journal was significantly ahead of schedule, which was a thing she allowed herself to be privately very pleased about. There was a morning in October again, the month it had all begun, when Theodora opened the shop at 6 and stood behind the counter in the early light with the first bread of the day cooling on the rack and the ledger open in front of her, and the day beginning the way her days began, full of the quiet satisfaction of her own work in her own place. And the door opened and John came in, not as a customer but as himself, in his coat, on his way to the office. Pausing, as he sometimes did in the morning, to say something he had thought of, and not yet said. He stood at the counter and looked at her with those gray eyes that still carried the quality she had first noticed 7 years ago, the full attention that felt like being seen, and he said, "Do you know that I still think this is the most useful place in Harlan's Creek?" "I told you," she said, "that whoever said that was flattering us both. And I still think the flattery is on my end," he said. She smiled at him across the counter, the full smile she had learned to give without managing it, and he smiled back, and the morning light came through the window of her shop and fell across the flour and the salt and the ledger and the bread, and she thought about $40 and a trunk of mended clothes and a woman who had been absolutely certain she did not need a single soul on this earth. She had been wrong about that, as it turned out. She had been precisely and completely wrong about that, in the best possible way, and she was grateful for the wrongness every single day. Outside the window, the Nevada sky was doing its morning work, turning from gray to rose to the particular brilliant blue that she had never been able to find a word for adequate enough. A blue that looked like it was lit from behind by something more than the sun. A blue that the Ohio sky had never tried to be. Thomas would be up soon, and then Frances, and the day would begin properly with all its noise and requirement and reward. And John would come back at midday if the work permitted, and sometimes when it didn't, because he was a man who came home when he could, and the nights would be the warm, settled quiet that she had learned to live inside rather than at the edge of. She turned back to her ledger and picked up her pencil and began the morning's accounting, the numbers proceeding in their orderly rows, everything balanced, everything accounted for, every column adding up to exactly what it should. The years continued to flow forward, and they flowed well. A third child came in 1882, a boy they named Henry George Wells, George for John's grandfather, who had been a schoolteacher in Missouri, and who John had spoken about with a particular admiring warmth that told her everything about who he was before she had known him. Henry was a different creature from his siblings, quieter than Thomas, more demonstrative than Frances, with an easy, warm temperament that made him loved by everyone who encountered him, and that Theodora privately attributed to the fact that by the time he arrived she had learned to be less guarded in her own warmth. And children, she believed, absorbed the emotional atmosphere of their households. Thomas, at 6, took his role as eldest sibling with a seriousness that was charming and occasionally excessive, and the house rang with the particular music of sibling negotiation, which Theodora and John navigated with the same combination of principled consistency and practical flexibility they brought to everything they managed together. The shop passed a landmark in 1883, 10 years since she had opened it, 6 years since the expansion, and a decade of accounts in the locked ledger that now required 3 volumes. She had thought about marking the anniversary, and then had thought that the marking itself was the work, and the work was still there the next morning, and that was the commemoration she preferred. John organized a dinner anyway, a quiet one, at the hotel, the same corner table that Margaret Chen's niece had given them on their first dinner 11 years ago, though the niece had married and moved to San Francisco, and Margaret herself was in her 80s now, and had moved into a smaller house, but had lost none of her comprehensive knowledge of the town's affairs. He came to collect her from the shop at 7, the children with the woman who sometimes helped with them in the evenings, and he looked at her with the full attention that still had the same quality it had always had, time having deepened rather than dimmed it, and said, 10 years of the best shop in the Nevada territory. That seems worth a dinner. You're biased, she said. Completely, he agreed. The dinner is still warranted. They walked to the hotel along the same 3 blocks she had walked home from the shop for nearly a decade, past the buildings that had changed, and the ones that hadn't, past the sheriff's office with its lights still on because the deputy he had trained was working a late shift, past the church and the schoolhouse and the widened main street of a town that had grown into the form that towns grow into when they are cared for. They walked the way they had walked for years, close, his hand finding hers in the natural way of long practice, the cold October air doing its Nevada best, and the stars overhead performing their excessive, beautiful Nevada excess. At the hotel corner she stopped, which surprised him, and he looked at her. She was looking up at the stars with the expression she had when she was thinking something through completely before she said it. I walked home down this street for 2 years before you got here, she said. Alone. Every evening. I didn't mind it, I thought. I had gotten very good at not minding things. She looked at him. And now when I walk this street with you, I think about how strange it is that the same geography can contain 2 such completely different lives. He looked back at her with the steady, attentive gray eyes. They're not 2 different lives, he said. They're one life. Everything that happened before is why everything after is what it is. She looked at him for a long moment, in the cold October starlight of the Nevada street, where she had built a life out of flour and salt and ledgers and sheer determined will, where a man had ridden in on a September Tuesday and bought coffee and cartridges and peaches, and used her name like he already knew it was worth something, where she had been asked a question she couldn't answer and had found the answer in the asking. Yes, she said. That's right, he squeezed her hand. Dinner, he said. Dinner, she agreed. They went into the warm light of the hotel, and the corner table was waiting, and the evening unfolded in the way their evenings unfolded, full of the particular quality of 2 people who know each other completely and are still interested in every word, who have built something that holds and continue building it, who love each other not with the frantic energy of the uncertain, but with the deep, settled, daily certainty of the very sure. And outside, the Nevada territory went on doing what it did, vast and indifferent and magnificent, and full of the particular light that fell differently here than it fell anywhere else, the light that had its own color and its own character, the light of a place where people came to build things from nothing and sometimes, if they were willing and fortunate and a little brave, found that the thing they built was a life they had not known how to want until they were already living it. Theodora Wallace Wells, who had arrived with $40 and a trunk of mended clothes and the absolute certainty that she needed no one, went home that night with her husband through the October stars, and the house was warm when they arrived, and the children were sleeping in the particular deep and total way that children sleep, and the stove was banked low and the lamplight was soft, and she stood in the front room of the house she had not built alone. That was the point. The beautiful and entirely unexpected point, and she was home. Who looked after her? They did. They looked after each other, and that, as it turned out, was all the answer the world had ever required.